My name is Allison. I'm 39 years old, a financial executive living in Austin, Texas. In 12 years of marriage, I never imagined I'd stand in the middle of a crowded room and hear my husband raise his glass and announce right there in front of our relatives, friends, even his mother's colleagues, "Allison won't be able to have children. We've decided to separate. And I'd like to introduce the person who made me believe in family again. This is Lindsay, and she's pregnant with my child." No one laughed. No one breathed. The room fell into absolute silence. I stood up. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply opened my purse and placed 3 items on the table: the deed to the house he once promised to his mistress, the DNA results of the child she was carrying, and the company transfer agreement Ethan thought he had full control over. If someone stabs you in the back, what would you do? Leave a comment if you've ever been betrayed. Tap like if you believe the truth always carries weight. And don't forget to subscribe, because what I'm about to share next, you won't be able to look away. I used to think I had a decent marriage. Not perfect, but decent. Ethan was the first man who made me feel chosen, needed, like we were building a future together. We met at a financial conference in Dallas. I was early in my career, just promoted to budget supervisor at a private hospital network. He had just left his family's business and wanted to launch something of his own. Ethan was charming, good-looking, Southern gentleman, smooth, and had a way of making people feel like they mattered. We got married after 8 months of dating. Fast, I know. But at the time I was almost 28, and Ethan at 33 was driven, confident in a way I used to admire. He said he wanted a big family. I laughed and told him we'd need to wait until I was more stable. The first 9 years passed like an unfinished novel. They were parts so beautiful, I forgot to turn the page. But then, something shifted. His family's gaze started to change. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, or birthday, my mother-in-law Barbara would pointedly ask, "So, anything new with Allison this year?" Besides work, of course. Once, she looked me straight in the eye and declared, "A woman without children has nothing to celebrate." I gave a weak smile. Ethan sat next to me, silent. He didn't look at me. Didn't look at his mother either. At first, I thought those comments were just empty chatter from older folks trying to fill quiet dinner tables. But then I noticed, every family gathering, I was placed at the far end of the table. The conversations were all about kids, motherhood, schools, and I was completely shut out, like I didn't belong. The family photos hanging in Barbara's hallway gradually featured only Ethan with his nieces and cousins' kids. His wife of over a decade, was erased from the frame. One night, while washing dishes together after dinner, I asked Ethan outright, "Are you ashamed of me?" He set the glass down a little too hard. "What are you talking about?" "About not having kids. About me having to fake a smile in front of your mom." Ethan sighed. "I don't want to get into that. My mom's old-fashioned. You know that. Don't let it bother you." "But what about you?" He said nothing. I began to wonder what was wrong with me. And when that question started haunting me enough to wake me in the middle of the night, I quietly made an appointment at a fertility clinic. For 2 years I swallowed vitamins, took hormone shots, did every hormone panel, tracked every cycle, changed my diet, did yoga, even saw an acupuncturist in Round Rock a friend recommended. All hoping for a miracle. But when the doctor called me in for the final results, I sat there, clutching a glass of cold water, heart dangling by a thread. "Allison, your numbers are all within normal range. We've done everything possible. You used to be capable of conceiving. Used to be. The issue isn't on your end." I swallowed. "You mean, you mentioned your husband hasn't been tested?" "I think now's the time to suggest he does." I sat there, speechless. All this time, I'd been blaming myself, carrying the weight, fearing I was the one dragging this marriage down. And yet all the pain, the sleepless nights, the quiet sobs in the bathroom, weren't because of me. Ethan had never taken the test, and I had never been strong enough to make him. That night, I came home and cooked dinner like usual. Grilled salmon, his favorite. I poured wine. Watched Ethan eat in silence. I wanted to ask, why? But my throat closed up. I just said, "I'm stopping treatment." He looked at me. No questions. No reaction. Just nodded. And kept eating. That was when I knew he knew. Ethan knew he was the one who couldn't have children. And he chose silence. He let me carry the guilt. Let me take the blame from his mother, from our friends, from the pitying stares of strangers. From that night on, I stopped trying to get pregnant. But I started something else. I started remembering. Noticing irregular withdrawals from our joint accounts. Remembering the times he lied about work trips. Watching the way he avoided future talk. I didn't say anything. Didn't make a scene. I just stepped back. Observed. Waited. Waited for Ethan's mask to slip. And I wouldn't have to wait long. Because once someone lets you carry all the guilt, they won't hesitate to betray you again. I wouldn't stay still. I started noticing subtle changes in Ethan's financial behavior at the end of last year. Small expenses at first: an expensive sports watch, a few first-class flights, lavish restaurant bills that never showed up on trips I took with him. I've worked in finance for nearly 2 decades, reviewed accounting books for entire hospital systems no number could hide from me once I set my mind to it. At first, I thought maybe he was buying gifts for clients. Ethan sometimes gave nice gifts to maintain relationships with big accounts. But then I stumbled upon a receipt in our shared inbox, a wire transfer to a luxury jewelry store in San Diego. It listed a diamond necklace, model Infinity Love, priced at over $8,000. The date? A Tuesday afternoon, when Ethan told me he had a strategy meeting in Houston. I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I needed to be sure. I needed to know the truth and have proof. I hired a private investigator named Martin. He was a retired financial crimes detective who now ran his own firm in Austin, specialized in catching liars. He didn't ask why I wanted the investigation. Just quietly said, "Give me his full name, license plate, general schedule. I'll bring you the truth." It took Martin 3 days to find the first thread. "Your husband's been withdrawing cash regularly from the company's account, then funneling it into a dummy nonprofit that has no real operations." I sat in silence at the coffee shop where we met. Martin placed a neat stack of color photos on the table, as organized as a medical file on a dying marriage. The recipient listed most often is Lindsay Mayer, 24. She interned at his firm last summer. Now runs her own design studio downtown. I flipped the first photo. Lindsay stepping out of a new SUV, wearing designer sunglasses, carrying a limited edition Chanel bag. Still very young. Pretty in a polished, innocent kind of way, but with sharp eyes that knew exactly what she was holding. Martin pulled out another stack. Plane tickets to Bozeman, Montana. Booked under Ethan Caldwell and Lindsay Mayer. Every 2 weeks. They rent a lakeside cabin near Flathead under an alias, drive up from the airport on weekends, living like a couple. I leaned back in my cold wooden chair, eyes locked on a picture of the two of them holding hands outside a small grocery near the cabin. Ethan wore a baseball cap, sleeves rolled up. He looked younger. And Lindsay was holding her belly. She was pregnant. Of course. Here is the natural American English translation with all units and formats adapted per your request, clear enough. But what sent a chill down my spine was Ethan's expression when he looked down at her belly. I had seen that look before, a long time ago. When he told me he wanted to build a family with me. When he touched my stomach and asked, "Do you think there's hope this month?" Martin didn't say a word. He just let me sit there in silence. Let me face the truth laid out on the table like a verdict. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove around downtown Austin, then turned into the old Marina district, where there was a wooden bridge overlooking the lake. I had once stood there 5 years ago, after a silent miscarriage that no one knew about but me. Ethan was busy in meetings up in Dallas. I didn't want to bother him. I went to the hospital alone, signed the paperwork, and came home by myself. I used to think endurance was a virtue. That if I just tried hard enough, everything would get better. But looking at those pictures, I understood something deeply. Ethan hadn't just betrayed me with another woman. He had betrayed the trust I had given him for 12 years. He left me to suffer through physical and emotional pain alone, while he went and built a whole other life, funded by money I helped earn. The next morning I still woke up early, like always. I still made coffee for both of us. Still made breakfast, set the table, closed the garage door after Ethan left. He had no idea I knew. I started reviewing the company files. Ethan didn't have a financial brain. I'd always handled the payment transfers, but lately, he had been skimming funds through a shell company. I collected each unusual expense, each suspicious invoice, and started building a separate report, a complete, detailed map of how Ethan had used company money to fund his affair. I also reached out to my personal attorney, an old college friend who now specializes in financial divorce consulting for entrepreneurs. I didn't say much. I just sent over the documents, an audio clip of Ethan calling Lindsay, the only woman who truly gets me, and a simple question: how can I protect what's mine? The answer: more than I expected. But I didn't take action right away. I needed time. I needed to understand who I was really dealing with. Because if Ethan was cold enough to fly his mistress to Montana every other week, use company money to buy her necklaces, an SUV, and even a lakeside villa, then he was certainly hiding more. What I'd seen was only the tip of the iceberg. And I wasn't going to let myself drown anymore. I met Lindsay exactly once before the truth came out. It was at a small fundraiser hosted by a local healthcare organization. Ethan told me he had meetings in San Antonio that day, but when I arrived as a primary donor, I saw him standing in the corner with a young blonde woman, grinning for the camera. Lindsay was wearing a tight pale blue dress, her hand resting softly on her belly like she was subtly revealing a secret. Ethan didn't see me, but Lindsay did. Her gaze met mine for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for her to know who I was, and long enough for me to know she wasn't the type to avoid conflict. I didn't approach her. I didn't say a word. I just left through the back exit. But I picked something up, a beige scarf draped loosely over the back of the chair she'd been sitting in. The scent of her perfume was light, sweet, and youthful. I folded it neatly, placed it in my purse, and told no one. 3 days later, the hair sample from that scarf was sent to a private lab I had personal connections with. I asked them to run a DNA test to see if there was a genetic link between the baby Lindsay was carrying and Ethan. I included a hair sample from Ethan's brush, secretly collected one morning when he left for a business trip. The technician asked if I was sure I wanted to know. I just nodded. It took 7 days to get the results. During that time I lived like the perfect wife. I still asked what he wanted for dinner. Still wished him good night before turning off the lights. Still made coffee just the way he liked it each morning. But inside, I was no longer a wife. I was an evidence collector. The results arrived on a Monday morning. A short email read: no genetic relationship detected between the fetus and Mr. Caldwell's DNA sample. I read it over and over. Every word carved a new layer of meaning. That child was not Ethan's. And Ethan didn't know. I printed the report, folded it, and placed it in the safe in my study. Then I opened my laptop and began researching Lindsay Mayer. I needed to know who this woman was, where she came from, and why she barged into my life like an uninvited actor on stage. She was born in a small town near Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her parents divorced early. She dropped out of college, then returned later to study interior design. She had once interned unpaid for Ethan's company for 3 months. And right after that internship ended, she somehow had the funds to open her own design studio in downtown Austin, where rent never falls below 5 figures a month. I even found photos of her at a conference in Miami with Ethan. That trip was never on any itinerary I'd seen. One post on social media read: "New beginnings. My little family." Underneath was a photo of her hand resting on her belly. No mention of Ethan, but in the photo was a wristwatch I had gifted my husband 3 years ago. Lindsay didn't know I knew. She still called Ethan the man of my life, still sent ultrasound images, still whispered sweet nothings into his ear. And Ethan, foolish like a teenage boy, believed he was about to become a father. A week later, Martin, the investigator I hired, reported that Ethan had just purchased a luxury condo near Zilker Park, jointly owned with Lindsay. I wasn't surprised. But the picture was becoming clearer. Lindsay didn't love Ethan. She was playing a role she believed would grant her access to a life of privilege, not through talent, but through the baby growing inside her. And Ethan was too eager, too desperate for a fresh start, to even question the most basic thing, whether the child was biologically his. I remembered what the doctor told me about Ethan's fertility. The chances of him fathering a child naturally are near zero. If he ever wants children, it'll take medical intervention or a miracle. There was no miracle here. Just naivete, laced with ambition. And I realized, Lindsay thought she was winning. She believed her growing belly was her shortcut to wealth, status, and the title of official wife. But what she didn't know was I was no longer playing the role of the kind-hearted spouse. I began archiving everything. The DNA results. The financial documents. The condo purchase agreement. Even the social media posts Lindsay deleted after a few hours, but I had already captured screenshots. Each piece was part of a puzzle. And once complete, it would show the full picture of greed, deceit, and the foolishness of a man I once loved. I moved to the next phase of my plan in complete silence, as if I were cleaning out a storage room my husband never cared to check. But this wasn't storage. This was the financial backbone of the company Ethan thought he ran, with me just in the background. On paper, we were co-founders. But everything that mattered, investment accounts, control of cash flow, share transfer clauses, had been built by me from day one. Ethan never had the patience to read more than 3 lines of any financial agreement. He always said, "I'm the creative one. You're the pilot." He was right. And when the pilot goes silent, the ship can change course without anyone noticing. I started by combing through the parent company system I had created 3 years ago as part of an expansion into healthcare. That company was registered under my name, operated separately, but had legal rights to invest in and acquire shares from the main firm. I had originally built it to optimize taxes and to shield strategic funds from broader risks. Now I used it as a net. Every payment, every percentage of shares, every slice of profit held by the main company was gradually moved into the parent company. Quietly. Legally. Just smart investment restructuring based on terms Ethan had signed without reading. I left just enough profit on the books so he wouldn't notice the shift. Ethan continued signing off on fund transfers like always, his mind busy thinking about how to finance a new mini yacht for this summer's getaway. And me, each night after he fell asleep, I'd open my laptop and comb through investment lines like a dancer checking her steps on an aging wooden floor. At the same time, I began rewriting my will. No more Ethan. No more split assets like the previous version. Now everything I owned, my personal shares, private properties, and individual investment funds, was designated to a new beneficiary, Emily. Emily is the daughter of my sister Sarah, who passed away from cancer 8 years ago. When Sarah died, Emily was only 11, curled up in a tiny black dress in the corner of the funeral home, clutching the bracelet her mother left behind. Our family was shattered in grief, but I made a promise that day I would never let Emily go without a single opportunity in life. I enrolled her in a private middle school in Dallas, quietly covering all her tuition, housing, and books. When Emily received a scholarship in communications at the University of Michigan, I was the one who attended her orientation. In her eyes, I was Aunt Allison, the single, busy aunt who always showed up when it counted. She didn't know that every dinner, every book she picked out at the bookstore came from a fund I'd quietly set aside years ago, a survival plan for 2 abandoned women. My lawyer, Karen, handled all the paperwork for the new asset transfer. She's in her 60s, went through a loud divorce with a federal judge, and has the kind of gaze no detail can slip past. "Are you sure you want to remove Ethan entirely from your will?" she asked during the final review. "I'm sure," I replied without hesitation. "What about joint assets?" "Everything held jointly. I've already rerouted through the parent company. Everything under my name. I safeguarded in court last year when Ethan agreed to revise the investment contract during the funding round." Karen nodded. "Then I'll just need final verification from the bank to complete the trust setup for Emily." "I already have it," I said, sliding over the statement from my personal fund. I left her office late in the afternoon. On the drive home, I called Emily. "You called at the perfect time," her excited voice came through the line. "Today I got selected to represent the student media group. We're starting a podcast about real-life inspiring women." "Is that so?" I smiled, eyes still tracing the orange-gold horizon. "I want you to be our first guest. You're the strongest woman I've ever known." I was quiet for a moment before replying softly, "I've never thought of myself as strong, Emily. I'm just learning how not to fall." "That's strength," she whispered. I ended the call as I pulled into the garage. Ethan wasn't home yet. On the dining table, I'd set dinner out of habit, though I wasn't sure if it was duty or just a way to keep the mask in place. But looking at it, I realized that in every little thing I still did. Each day, I was slowly exiting his life like someone packing up and leaving, while the other person never noticed the luggage disappearing. I wasn't destroying things. I was dismantling them one layer at a time with the patience of someone who understood the most valuable thing she owned wasn't property, it was time. And I had started reclaiming it, 1 second at a time. That Wednesday afternoon, just after I stepped out of a meeting with our senior accounting team, my phone rang. Unknown number, New York area code. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut warned me. I picked up as I stepped into my office and shut the door behind me. Hello, may I speak with Mrs. Allison Caldwell? This is she, I answered, opening my laptop and glancing at my schedule. Thank you for taking the call. My name is Douglas Lee, legal representative of Larkin & Co. We're currently managing an equity transaction that involves your company. I froze, eyes locking onto the screen. Larkin & Co. was one of the East Coast's more aggressive venture capital firms known for swooping in when founders were desperate for cash or trying to escape internal collapse. And why are you calling me? Because your name appears in the eligibility clause required to complete the transaction, he replied, polite but firm. We've received a transfer file for 48% of shares from Mr. Ethan Caldwell, co-founder. However, based on the original operating agreement provided to us, any equity transfer exceeding 15% must include written consent from you. I closed my eyes. A long pause stretched between us before I exhaled slowly. Something cold and sharp settled in my chest. Can you send me a copy of the file? Of course. Please confirm a secure email address. I gave him the private address I used for high-level transactions, then ended the call with a curt thank you. Within 10 minutes, the email arrived. I opened the PDF file and scanned every page, every word. Ethan was trying to sell nearly half the company's shares at a price 30% below market value. What was worse, the buyer was none other than a newly formed subsidiary, legally registered under the name Lindsay Mayer. He was handing off the future value of a company I helped build to his mistress. He thought that simply transferring ownership would keep me from stopping it. He still believed I was just the quiet woman at the table, waiting to be invited to speak. But Ethan had forgotten something critical. I was the one who drafted our original founding agreement 16 years ago. Back when he was busy building his personal brand, I was sitting with lawyers, inserting protective clauses including a control clause that required both co-founders' written consent for any transfer above 15%. Without my signature, the deal was invalid. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the original signed agreement, sealed in an envelope. Clause 8.3. Any transfer of equity exceeding 15% must be subject to written consent by both co-founders, in ink, notarized and recorded. I had that notarized during our first year. I replied to Douglas with a scanned excerpt of the clause in a single sentence. I do not consent to any equity transfer involving Mr. Ethan Caldwell at this time. Please halt all proceedings immediately. Less than an hour later, Douglas called back. Thank you for your quick response. We're pausing all actions and will notify Mr. Caldwell that the conditions for transfer are not met. I appreciate your transparency, I said, voice steady. And I advise you to double-check any other assets before signing with Ethan. He might be trying to sell things that don't belong to him. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a long while in my office. I thought about how Ethan always assumed I lacked ambition. That I chose finance because it was safe and unflashy. That I didn't understand branding, high-risk growth, or visionary leadership. I used to stay quiet, let him take the spotlight at shareholder meetings like I was just a shadow behind his tailored suits. But now he was trying to use the very foundation I built to create a new life for himself and his mistress. And he forgot I laid every brick of this system, every investment channel, every clause. I didn't need to shout. I just needed a signature, and I would never sign betrayal. That evening when Ethan came home, he hung up his coat like always and walked into the kitchen looking tired. Hungry? I asked without looking up. Yeah. A little, he said. Back-to-back meetings all day. I poured him a glass of water, placed it on the table, then went back to cleaning the cabinets. I said nothing about the call. Nothing about the contract. Nothing about Lindsay. I wanted to see how long he'd keep lying. I wanted to give him one final chance to tell the truth. But when dinner ended and Ethan set down his glass with a weary sigh, I knew he wasn't going to say a word. Because in his mind, I was still the woman who never knew anything. And that was his greatest mistake. I went to the bank on a weekday morning, carrying a thick file nearly 300 pages long. Inside were copies of the company's founding agreement, financial statements from recent years, and a notarized power of attorney prepared by my attorney in advance. The person who met with me was Paul Henderson, the deputy director in charge of high net worth clients. We'd met several times before during corporate account restructuring, but I came with a different request. We have joint accounts, both personal and business, I said, opening the file and pointing to a specific document. I want to temporarily freeze all accounts held jointly under the names Allison and Ethan Caldwell, based on the Financial Risk Prevention Clause and the Asset Coordination Control rights. Paul looked at me, his expression shifting after a few seconds. You're looking to implement a dispute prevention measure. I want to stop any misuse of company funds before it's too late, I replied calmly. I have evidence that the other party in the account is using funds for personal expenses that have nothing to do with business operations. And I have full legal grounds to request this action. I handed over an additional letter drafted by attorney Karen, requesting tighter control over all transactions linked to Ethan Caldwell's name. Paul didn't say anything further. He nodded, called in an assistant, and the entire process was completed in under 30 minutes. On the way out of the bank, I called someone else, Andrew Miller, an independent auditor who had worked with me on an internal audit project 3 years ago. Andrew was meticulous, discreet, and, most importantly, not easily influenced. I left him a simple voice message. I need you to investigate all of Ethan's expense-related transactions from the past 2 years. Full legal audit format. As soon as possible. 3 days later, Andrew called back. His voice was low and clear over the phone. I've completed the initial review. What I found is pretty serious, Allison. I'm listening. There are at least 19 payments from company accounts to services not outlined in any contract: luxury hotels, personal flight tickets, gift cards, and a few suspicious charges tied to a jewelry store in San Diego. I wasn't surprised. But when Andrew continued, I finally saw the full extent of Ethan's recklessness. The most notable are 2 large transactions: a $25,000 advance listed as a media partner studio sponsorship, and a $42,000 transfer to an account under the name Lindsay Mayer, labeled as product development costs. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting to the window. The Austin sky was heavy and gray that day, thick with clouds hinting at a coming cold rain. I took a deep breath. Can you prepare the report in standard litigation format? I asked. It's already done. I'll have it sent to your attorney's office by the end of today. That afternoon, I sat with Karen in her quiet office, the wind hissing softly through the window frame. With transactions like these, Karen said, flipping through the pages of Andrew's report, we are absolutely in a position to send a cease and desist letter to Lindsay Mayer for unlawful use of company funds. And if she doesn't cooperate, I'll move forward with a civil lawsuit immediately. I nodded. I don't want to destroy her life. But I need her to understand this isn't a game. Karen smirked, her gaze sharp as a blade. Women like her only take the law seriously when it arrives on subpoena paper. The next morning, Lindsay received her first email from the legal office. It laid out the related transactions, the receiving accounts, the improper usage of funds, and a firm recommendation to return the full amount within 7 days. It came with a warning: failure to comply would result in legal action for misappropriation of corporate funds, falsifying usage purposes, and aiding financial misconduct. I didn't have to wait long. By that afternoon, Martin, the investigator I'd hired, texted me. Lindsay had contacted a private attorney, appeared panicked, and was frantically trying to reach Ethan. They met at a discreet cafe in the East Riverside area. Martin sent me a photo. Lindsay hunched over, her face pale, hands trembling as she opened her laptop. Ethan sat across from her, hands on the table, a look of unraveling control on his face. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not because I felt smug, but because I knew what that kind of disorientation felt like. I had once sat that way too in front of a doctor, holding a test result that wasn't even mine but still changed the course of my life. The difference was, I didn't chase anyone to salvage a life built on lies. Lindsay, on the other hand, was realizing that the man she'd bet everything on had nothing but debt and empty promises. And everything she thought she could snatch for herself was completely out of reach, guarded by a woman she once considered invisible. I closed the laptop and glanced at the clock. Barbara's birthday party would take place in 3 days. Ethan still didn't know I was aware of everything, and Lindsay was beginning to learn that this wasn't a two-player game. The most powerful piece had never left the board. I'd never enjoyed parties at Barbara's house. They were always too crowded, too loud, and had an unspoken air of orchestration that made me feel like a spectator in my own life. But today, I arrived with a clear purpose. In the black leather purse beside me wasn't lipstick or a wallet but the truth. Barbara's 60th birthday party was hosted in the banquet hall behind a high-end Italian restaurant. The kind where the air instantly filled with the scent of olive oil and garlic the moment you stepped in. Nearly 70 guests were present, family, longtime friends, even some of Ethan and Barbara's former colleagues. White linens covered the round tables, wine glasses sparkled, and laughter floated through the room. I sat to Ethan's left, smiled politely, greeted people who came over, and checked the time now and then. I knew what he was about to do. I knew because I had a recording captured without his knowledge where his voice outlined the plan like it was just another calendar event. "Your mom's birthday is the perfect moment," Ethan's voice said casually in the recording. "Everyone will be there. I'll announce the split in front of them all. Allison won't make a scene in front of Barbara." 18 minutes after the birthday cake was brought out and the last note of happy birthday faded, Ethan stood up. He raised his glass, gently tapped it with a silver spoon like he was about to give a toast of gratitude. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the son Barbara was so proud of. He smiled, scanning the room with practiced charm. "I just want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate with our family today," Ethan began warmly. "But I also have something important to share." I placed my hand on the purse, feeling the papers inside still intact, their weight steady in my palm. "After many years together, Allison and I have decided to go our separate ways," Ethan said, his voice calm and composed, like he was announcing a shift in a company merger. "We no longer share the same vision. And I'm very grateful for the time we had." A ripple of whispers spread through the room like waves lapping against the shore. "And today, I'd like to introduce someone who has given me new hope for a real family. This is Lindsay." A few gasps. Lindsay stood up from a table in the back, hand resting proudly on her stomach. Her wine-red dress was a bit too bold for a 60-year-old's birthday party, but it was clear she hadn't come to blend in. Barbara turned to look at me, brow furrowed. She was surprised but not disapproving. For her, as long as there was a baby, a continuation of the bloodline, it didn't matter who carried it as long as it wasn't me. Ethan looked like he was about to keep speaking, but I had already stood up. My voice wasn't loud but it was clear enough for the entire room to hear. "Thank you, Ethan. You're right, today is an important day. But not for the reason you just announced." I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, placing it gently on the table in front of him. Then I opened the flap. "This is the medical report for Ethan Caldwell," I said, my eyes locked on my ex-husband's face. "Doctor's conclusion: complete infertility. Unable to father a child without medical intervention." The murmuring in the room abruptly stopped. Ethan's face turned ghostly pale. "And this," I continued, pulling out another file, "is a DNA test conducted with a sample of the pregnant woman's hair and Ethan's genetic profile. Conclusion: no biological relationship." Lindsay took a step back, her hand falling from her belly. I didn't stop. "And here," I presented another folder, "a business contract, is the attempted share transfer document Ethan processed in secret, naming Lindsay Mayer. Unfortunately, it holds no legal weight. Because final veto rights belong to me. And I never signed." No one said a word. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above us. "And finally, I pulled a small USB drive from my inner jacket pocket. I have a recording from a private internal meeting between Ethan and Lindsay. Exact quote. I only married Allison because she had money. Now she's old and can't have kids, so I need to start over. I didn't need to play the recording. Ethan's eyes confirmed everything. In that moment, he turned toward Lindsay as if begging for help, but she stared back with nothing but disbelief. No one in that room spoke. Even Barbara turned away, her hand trembling as she clutched her water glass, unsure how to process the truth. I gathered the documents, neatly placing them back in my bag. I came here to wish Barbara a happy birthday, I said, looking straight at the woman who had never hidden her disdain for me. Thank you for giving me the perfect moment to tell the truth. Then I walked out, my heels echoing slowly across the marble floor. I didn't look back. Because from that moment on, I was leaving behind not just a broken marriage but every lie I'd ever been forced to accept as truth. Just as I stepped into the hallway, I heard a loud crash behind me, followed by a flurry of whispers and a shrill voice slicing through the tension-heavy air. You think I'm some idiot, Ethan? I didn't have to turn around to know what had just happened. Lindsay had realized she had nothing left to protect. As the documents I revealed passed from hand to hand, the curious looks turned to shock, then to silence. A man once invited to speak at business summits, once toasted at family events as a model of honor and success, now stood shaking, gripping the table edge like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Lindsay stepped forward without hesitation. The red dress she'd worn like a victory banner now looked like a streak of blood cutting through the still crowd. She raised her hand. The slap rang out loud enough for me to hear from the hallway. All eyes turned. Ethan staggered, clutching his cheek, stunned. Lindsay, breathing hard, nearly screamed, "You told me to wear nice heels and fancy makeup to make a great first impression. And this is what you brought me to." Ethan flailed, his voice cracking. "It's just a misunderstanding. Allison made all this up. She did it out of jealousy. Because she knows she can't have kids." Lindsay snapped, her eyes blazing. "So you knew you were infertile and still let me believe? Let me call you the father of a baby you knew wasn't yours?" Ethan's mouth hung open, speechless. The entire room froze like glass. "And the money? All of it, the mansion, the yacht, the condo, the cars, they weren't even yours? And yet you walked around like some kind of king." Lindsay scoffed, then spun on her heel, her stilettos pounding the tile like final blows to Ethan Caldwell's shattered reputation. No one stopped her. No one dared. The very people who once praised Ethan now avoided his gaze like his shame might be contagious. A man publicly exposed at a party, abandoned by his mistress, laid bare by his ex-wife, there wasn't much of him left that anyone wanted to remember. Ethan looked toward me, as if grasping for even a sliver of sympathy. But I had already left that room behind, leaving him with exactly the game he thought he had been in control of. I got a text as I reached my car. It was from an old housekeeper of Barbara's. "Miss Allison." Barbara fainted after Lindsay stormed out. "The whole family's in chaos." I smirked. Not out of satisfaction, but because I knew what really brought that woman to her knees wasn't her son's disgrace, it was a sentence whispered by her oldest friend, standing behind her when I showed the house ownership papers. "Barbara, you said Ethan owned the house. But this deed says Allison. You told us you made him force her to waive all marital claims." "Exactly. 10 years ago, when Ethan and I bought the house in West Austin, Barbara insisted I sign a document giving up joint ownership because she wanted to preserve the family estate. Ethan had agreed, saying I only needed my name on a small section of the deed. But I, being a finance professional, quietly prepared a reverse transfer agreement officially notarized and filed separately that shifted full ownership to me 2 years later when Ethan needed to use the property as collateral for a personal loan. That document was never revoked. That house no longer belonged to Ethan. And Barbara, in that moment of collapse, understood it all. I could still hear her voice from years ago, sneering at me across the dinner table. A woman who can't bear children or keep a man shouldn't expect to keep a house. Now she was the one who had lost everything. At what was supposed to be her moment of triumph, her son became a public disgrace, her ex-daughter-in-law commanded the room's silence. And the mistress she once quietly supported walked out without a backward glance. Ethan had nothing left. No wife. No mistress. No company. No home. And worst of all, no dignity. I sat in the car, hands on the wheel, watching the late afternoon light spill across the windshield. It wasn't over yet. But in that quiet moment, I knew I had reclaimed something I'd once lost, my place in this life. And no one, neither Ethan nor Barbara, would ever take that from me again. The courtroom was unusually full that morning. Not chaotic or noisy, just tense. I sat at the left table with my attorney, Karen, my hands resting on the neatly tabbed files categorized by subject. Finances, assets, corporate activity, violations, all supported by notarized evidence. Ethan arrived 5 minutes late, accompanied by a young, frazzled-looking lawyer, clearly not his first pick. That man, my ex-husband, looked gaunt, his chin covered in patchy stubble, his shirt slightly wrinkled at the shoulders. There was nothing left of the man who once gave speeches about real family just a few weeks earlier. The judge was Eleanor Hughes, a woman in her 60s, short gray hair, dark-rimmed glasses, and eyes sharp as glass. As she entered and called the session to order, I caught a flicker in her gaze, not bias but a quiet recognition, like she had known who I was before I even spoke. Karen leaned in and whispered, "She's Julia's mom, the woman you helped last year. The one who escaped financial abuse because of your independence planning advice." I didn't answer. I just nodded slightly, sitting a little taller, as if that truth had just added steel to my spine. The hearing began with Ethan's side presenting. His lawyer fumbled through hastily copied documents, trying to argue that company assets were shared property and Ethan's stock transfers were for the firm's benefit. But when Judge Hughes asked for the original founding contract detailing ownership rights, they had nothing. Karen didn't waste a moment. She stood, walked to the center of the courtroom, and held up the original company formation contract signed by both parties and notarized 13 years ago. I saw Judge Hughes glance over Clause 8.3, the one I had read, over and over again, night after night, memorized in the palm of my hand. "The veto clause," Karen said clearly. "Any transfer of more than 15% of company shares requires signed approval from both co-founders, notarized, and filed with the Texas State Business Coordination Office." Mr. Ethan Caldwell transferred 48% of shares to a third party without Mrs. Allison Caldwell's consent. "Supporting evidence," Karen continued, "includes the signed contract between Ethan and Lindsay Mayer, a forensic financial audit report, and documentation of a non-transparent receiving account." Ethan started to rise, as if to object, but Judge Hughes raised her hand for silence. "I will allow the plaintiff to complete her statement," the judge said. "Mr. Caldwell, you'll have your turn to respond." Karen moved on to the second point, misuse of company assets for personal purposes. She displayed detailed bank transactions, screenshots from accounting software, hotel receipts, jewelry invoices, and flight tickets, none of which fell under approved expenses. "Even if we generously assume these were personal costs," she said, "using company funds without financial authorization violates corporate ethics and could be subject to civil liability." I remained silent. There was no need to interrupt. The truth was speaking for me. Judge Hughes flipped through the files, quietly reviewing each page. After a few minutes, she looked up, her gaze landing squarely on Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have any evidence that these transactions were legitimate? Any internal documentation from the company confirming them?" Ethan's lawyer mumbled something incoherent and handed over a document without a signature. Judge Hughes didn't even bother looking closely. "I've worked with enough companies to recognize an invalid ledger," she said plainly. Karen continued with the final section. "Personal assets. The Austin home, retirement, accounts, emergency funds, all clearly listed, notarized, and lawfully owned. Most of it was my own hard-earned savings from 12 years of relentless work, protected by prior legal agreements. Specifically," Karen said, "we ask the court to formally recognize that the Austin home is not part of the marital property split, as the deed was fully transferred to Mrs. Allison 3 years ago. It was notarized and used as collateral for her personal credit trust." Ethan jumped up again. "She forced me to sign. She tricked me." Still, I said nothing. I simply looked at him, the man who once convinced me to sell my first shares to build a dream together, now flailing in a system he thought would always be his to control. The hearing stretched on for over an hour. Once all the evidence had been presented, Judge Hughes sat quietly for a long moment, then tapped her gavel. The court recognizes, Mrs. Allison Caldwell retains full legal ownership of company shares and is entitled to continue managing and controlling all corporate assets. Mr. Ethan Caldwell has no further financial claim and is barred from using the title of co-founder in any public dealings. As for personal property, she continued, the court affirms Mrs. Allison's legal ownership of the Austin residence, all retirement accounts, and her individual investments. Mr. Caldwell shall retain only his existing personal possessions and a limited support stipend for 3 months. Ethan slumped back into his chair. His posture no longer carried the confidence it had when he walked in. I stood, bowed slightly to Judge Hughes, and met her eyes. There was a softness to them. You did the right thing not just for yourself. I didn't reply. But I knew deep down that what she said wasn't just a judge's acknowledgement, it was the